It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. This is the fifth talk of the series called Inferentialism on Naturalized Grounds, organized by the Elme Center at the University of Hradec Králové. The series accompanies a special issue of philosophical topics that is about to be published this spring. Today, our speaker is Professor Bernhard Weiss from the University of Cape Town. Professor Weiss has a long-lasting interest in philosophy of language. He published several books on major figures of philosophy of language, including Brandom and Dummett, and he also published a book, How to Understand Language, in which he focuses on social aspects of language. Today's talk also focuses on social and normative aspects of language, though from a rather evolutionary and distinct perspective. Professor Weiss, you can start whenever you are ready.
Okay, thanks, Matej, and thanks for the invitation, both to write the paper and then to present it, and thanks to all of you for turning up today. So the paper is a paper attempting to tell a story about the evolution of language. So for me, it involves a very different type of work to work I've done in the past in philosophy. Because it's meant that I've spent a lot of time, sorry, that's my dogs barking at each other in the background. So it's meant that I've spent a lot of time reading things that I'm unfamiliar with, work in psychology and ethology, primatology, archaeology, but this has been a lot of fun, in part because when I've followed a line of thinking, I've discovered that other people have been thinking about these kinds of issues already. So it's quite exciting to come across this material, to know that people have not only been thinking about this sort of stuff, but they've been designing experiments to test these ideas out. But they do often from very different perspectives to the perspective that I've taken in getting there. So it's taken quite a bit of work to pull this together in a story that is coherent from my point of view. And I'm not sure I'm there yet, but you'll be the judges of that. So let me dive into the story. So what I aim to do here is to tell a plausible route for the evolution of normative practice. So my interest in that is, I guess, not connected as it might be with naturalism. I'm not really persuaded by any naturalistic position in philosophy, but I am persuaded by this remark by Peter Winch, that philosophy has no business to be anti-scientific. If it tries to be so, it will succeed only in making itself look ridiculous. And I think so. I think on the one hand that as philosophers, we need to think about how our philosophical views about a phenomenon, and in my case, it's a philosophical view about the nature of language, is connected, links with work in science, which addresses a similar or the same topic. So if I'm interested in language, I think I need to reconcile my philosophy with a plausible account of the evolution of language. But likewise, I think if I have a philosophical view about the nature of language, that's going to influence the scientific program of trying to give an evolutionary account of language, because what you're trying to give an account of depends in part what you take the phenomenon itself to be. So what I'm trying to do here is to give an account of how norms come to be part of the world. I'm not trying to explain norms in other terms. I'm just trying to explain in a plausible fashion how they develop. But then I think because I've got this interest in the philosophy, in language itself, because moreover I'm committed to a view which sees language as a distinctive kind of normative practice, I think that can feed into an account which gives an explanation of how language comes to be, how language develops. And like I said, I want to read a philosophical lesson into scientific approaches to the evolution of language and the evolution of normative practice. So I think there is something that what I'm going to call normative pragmatism can offer to the scientific enterprise, because it seems to offer a very distinctive intermediary in the development of language, namely the development of normative practice itself. For instance, if you take a contrasting approach where you think that the development of devices of reference are crucial in the development of language, with reference, you will get normativity. So you won't proceed from reference to normativity. But in contrast, if you think normativity is embedded in language and language develops as a normative practice, there's likely to be normative practices which precede and are different to linguistic practices. So that, I think, both generates a possibility, a kind of potential that goes with the account and the conception of language. It also sets a limit to what I'm doing here. I'm interested here in the evolution of norms. And so there's a big task left remaining at the end of this paper, which is to explain, if you think that we can explain how normative practice develops, we then need to explain how specifically linguistic normative practices develop from that. So that's the broad aim of the paper. I also have a goal. I think on the one hand, what we need to do is chart a course which finds a route between the scylla of failing to discern sophisticated mentality in pre-linguistic creatures. I think it would be daft to try and explain the evolution of language without thinking that it evolved in creatures with reasonably sophisticated mentality. But on the other hand, I think we also need to avoid the charybdis, which would involve seeing language as simply the product of the articulation of pre-existing thought, thought which exists prior to language. So on the one hand, I want to do justice to the idea that we need to think of language as developing in creatures with sophisticated mentality without attributing to those creatures complex propositional thought, which is then articulated in a linguistic system. So avoiding scillas, I think, again, taking account of the deliverances of science. So again, it's adhering to Winch's idea that philosophy can't make itself look ridiculous by ignoring the aims, the findings of science. And I think this is part of my commitment to normative pragmatism about content. One can't presuppose that content already exists prior to language. So we need to give it a description of how normative practices develop without ascribing contentful thought to creatures. And the shape of the solution that I'm going to suggest is firstly to try and describe how participation in a normative practice needn't, at least possibly needn't, involve creatures who can think in propositional terms. And secondly, that a lot of the mentality that we're going to have to think of, because I'm going to be thinking of creatures who are tool makers. So there's quite sophisticated mentality involved, but the mentality isn't itself drawn on in the account of how creatures then manage to follow rules. All that's drawn on is that as a context or a setting in which normative practice might develop. So let me push on and try and say something about how I conceive of the normative. So I take my cue from Wittgenstein in this as in many other things. So let me read this crucial section of philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein says, this was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. The answer was, if everything can be made out to accord with the rule, then it can also be made out to conflict with it. And so there would be neither accord nor conflict here. So that's the paradox of rule following vanishing. But then he goes on, it can be seen that there's a misunderstanding here from the mere fact that in the course of our argument, we give one interpretation after another, as if each one contented us, at least for a moment, until we thought of yet another standing behind it. What this shows is that there's a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which is exhibited in what we call obeying a rule and going against it in actual cases. So, I mean, it would take a lot of work fully to unpack how Wittgenstein gets to this point and what Wittgenstein's point is. What I'm going to take from it is simply this, is that Wittgenstein seems to be here turning his back on a constitutive account of what rule following consists in. What he asks us to do is to look at what exhibits rule following. And what exhibits rule following is us in actual practice calling certain moves within the practice cases of obeying the rule or going against it. And I call that this practice of monitoring one another's practice a policing practice. So I think Wittgenstein's given us strong clues as to what character a policing practice has. According to Wittgenstein, it will include both moves which involve taking a move to be one of obeying a rule and other moves to be moves of going against the rule. So I call those moves of commendation and condemnation respectively, or collectively moves of correction. And additionally, I think we need to discern a move of retraction, whereby a practitioner can, in a sense, take back a move that they've already performed. Okay, I think, well, in part, I think we need the latter, that is retraction, if we're going to base an adequate semantics for language on normative practice, but that's something I argue in different work and isn't really going to affect us because, like I said, our focus is not here on language, but on normative practice itself. But I think a comparison might help bring out both the relevance of retraction and the kind of development that I am hoping to be able to say something about. It seems that there's many non-normative practice in the animal kingdom which involve practitioners reacting to one another's performances or behavior and thereby maintaining certain regularities of behavior. I don't think of those practices as themselves normative. So their practices, for instance, deeply involved in things like rank hierarchies, which I think involve a kind of peer pressure. So there's no doubt here that you get moves of which involve monitoring one another's practice. So there's reaction to one another's practice, which counts as monitoring. But I don't think that these are normative. So I'm going to call these monitoring moves of encouragement, discouragement, and perhaps moves of placation as well. And so I think a plausible story of the evolution of fully normative practice will be a story which shows how a policing practice develops from a mere monitoring practice. But before we get on to the story about how the one develops from the other, I think we need to get clear about some of the differences between monitoring and policing. So I think that the basic difference, which plays itself out in a number of ways, is that a monitoring practice is entirely forward-looking. So the point of a monitoring practice is that it encourages and maintains certain regularities of behavior. So it plays a purely causal role in fixing patterns of behavior within the community. So it is entirely forward-looking. Whereas I think a proper policing practice is backward-looking in at least the following ways. And it's important that it's backward-looking because in a normative practice, I think the normative history of the practice matters. So for instance, in a normative practice, the admissibility of a certain move will warrant repetition of what counts as the same move. I don't think it's simple to say what counts as the same move, but nonetheless, if a move counts as the same move, then the persistence of a move within the practice will warrant its repetition. So a move of condemnation will undercut that warrant. Similarly, retraction, and I think this is the important backward-looking element of retraction. Retraction relieves a practitioner of responsibility for a move. So practitioners in a normative practice, having made a move, develop commitments from having made that move. Retraction relieves them of those commitments. And because they purely have a purely causal role, I think encouragement, discouragement, and placation are temporally sensitive. That causal role is something which is affected by the passage of time, whereas the proper moves of policing, commendation, condemnation, and retraction might well become more difficult to affect as time goes by, but their role is unaffected by the passage of time. So in a certain sense, they're provided they can target a certain move, their efficacy is not at all sensitive to time. What they do is target a move and affect the normative status of that move. What I think we now need to do, if we're thinking about the passage from a monitoring to policing practice, is to try and find a set of processes leading from monitoring to policing where, since we want this to be a plausible story, coincides with evidence that's available, which since we want it to be plausible in terms of scientific theory, we wanted to explain also how each aspect of the process realizes or reacts to a selection pressure. In other words, gives advantages to the creatures and who possess it, and does so in ways which enhance their reproductive success. And finally, I think having given an account of how normativity develops in an evolutionary setting, we want some account of the evolutionary advantage of the normative as such. So having said what kind of tasks face us, I now want to kind of backtrack in just how successful I think I have been in addressing all of those tasks. So first, I mean, as to the evidence. All the evidence that I present is heavily disputed. It's entirely, it's completely controversial. But it is drawn from papers that address the issue. So it's plausible, at least in a kind of dialectical sense. Like many others, I think a lot of people writing in this area take it as plausible that something will have a selective advantage if it seems to realize a certain good for the creature without then saying how that good enhances specifically reproductive success. So I'm going to note that this is something that's a feature of the debate, and it's also a feature of a lot of what I have to say. And I'm going to end with the merest sketch as to how it might be that the evolution of the normative as such might be important. And as I think I've said this already twice, I'll say it again, and we'll say it again at the end, is that there's no account in this paper of how specifically linguistic norms develop. So that's an interesting, I think, large project, which maybe this paper takes us to the point of addressing. Okay, so I'm going to present a proposal for the genesis of norms. And like I said, I kept, when I was writing this paper, developing certain thoughts and then finding similar thoughts in various literatures. So I discovered that the account that I want, that seemed to me plausible is in fact an account called, or a theory called, and it has various forms, the technological pedagogical hypothesis. So views which fall under this title are views which try and explain the origin of language by thinking about how language is implicated in the process of actively transmitting technological developments. So mine is a proposal which falls within that camp, but what distinguishes it from many, if not most, of these proposals is that most of those proposals are targeted directly on language. So as I said, I'm not focusing directly on language, I'm focusing simply on the origin of normative practice. So I'll present you with this. It's a conjecture, and in fact, it's a piece of autobiography. When I started thinking about this, I was interested in practices where creatures react to one another's behavior, and was drawn to thinking about rank hierarchies. But it seems to me that there might be a connect, but then I felt that rank hierarchies, for various reasons, as we'll soon see, don't provide a good setting for the development of normative practice, but might provide some of the raw material for the development of normative practice. So I think if you look at rank hierarchies, at least in creatures like baboons have particularly elaborate rank hierarchies and so have been well studied, but baboons, perhaps chimpanzees as well. So you have a situation in which creatures monitor one another's behavior or react to one another's behavior, and they have, in baboons, threat behaviors which take in a loose sense as behaviors which disapprove of another's behavior, so they're discouragements, they discourage a certain way of behavior. So those are the threat barks. Then there's approvals which encourage behavior, and these aren't noted so often, but very often a dominant baboon will wander around grunting his approval at submissive behavior when that behavior is appropriate, and of course there'll be submissions where a subordinate baboon will accept the threat and try and placate it. What I think is distinctive about these kinds of behavior, and I guess why I don't think they provide a good basis for the development of normative behavior or normative practice, is that what they seem focused on is not development of specific patterns of behavior, but a whole set of behaviors, which in general mean that a superior individual gets better access to a variety of resources over subordinate individuals. And the effect of that is to reinforce individuals' positions in the hierarchy. So it seems to me less that these kinds of behaviors in that context are focused on development of a certain sort of practice, but on maintaining a hierarchy and so on maintaining the position of individuals within that hierarchy. Let me move on. Okay, sorry, this is filling up slightly erratically. So I think a better place to look for the evolution of behaviors which serve to reinforce patterns of behavior and so a practice is the practice of mimicry. Where very often you find situations where one creature will simply, there's a natural inclination to imitate other creatures. So you get cases of creatures imitating what others are doing. For instance, that's how many apes learn how to make their nests at night. They simply imitate what other apes are doing. But also you get an interest in one creature will take an interest in what the other's doing. So for instance, often they will finish a task that another's doing. If one ape starts making a nest and has difficulty, another ape will get in there and finish making the nest. So, Tomasello uses that as kind of evidence that creatures are able to discern others' intentions. But it seems much more likely that what's happening here is just that the creature is sensitive to what the other is doing. So given that situation, given that there's a propensity for one creature to imitate another creature and for creatures to be interested in one another's actions and sometimes to take an interest in the success of the other's actions, it would, I don't think, be implausible to suggest that behaviors which have been used in modifying behavior, so maybe behaviors which exist already in rank hierarchies, might move over into that situation in which there's supposedly an active transmission of behavior and behavior which you think might amount to certain skills. So there's little evidence for active demonstration of this kind that I've been gesturing at in ethological studies of the animal kingdom. So I'm going to turn to archaeological evidence in a moment. But I think it's worth at this stage of just contrasting that position with the position I've just outlined of how monitoring behavior in the context of a rank hierarchy is focused on individuals in reinforcing their position within the rank hierarchy. In the cases that we were interested in contrast, the pattern of behavior is shared between model and imitator. Whereas in the rank hierarchy, obviously the behavior is quite different. The subordinate dispersed behave quite differently to the way the dominant individual behaves. Both model and imitator can be assumed to have a pro-attitude towards the acquisition of the behavior. It's certainly not true in the rank hierarchy case. And so I think it makes sense to say that here, unlike in the rank hierarchy case, monitoring seems to be focused on patterns of behavior which maintain a certain practice. So it's, I think the vocabulary one wants to use in describing this kind of situation is vocabulary of authority and deference. Authority that goes with pedagogy as opposed to the vocabulary of domination and submission. So, as I said, I want to turn to the archaeological evidence, but I want to do so by setting that in a little bit of a philosophical context. So here's Wilfrid Sellers. So Sellers says, but what of the objection that the subject matter subjects of an ought to be? Let me just give you an example of an ought to be for Sellers. So for Sellers, an ought to be is, an example of an ought to be is that Ceteris paribus, one ought to respond to red objects in sunlight by uttering or being disposed to utter, this is red. So the important point for Sellers about an ought to be is that that ought to be might apply to an individual independently of the individual possessing the concepts of red object and sunlight. So what of the objection that the subject matter subjects of an ought to be coincide with the agent subjects of the ought to do? So the corresponding ought to do for the ought to be that I just read out is for Sellers, one ought to bring it about that Ceteris paribus, people respond to red objects in sunlight by uttering or being disposed to utter, this is red. So unlike, this is the important point, unlike the ought to do, ought to be, the ought to do presupposes conceptual competence. So the worry that Sellers is raising here is how is it that we can have a situation in which we have a normative practice, in which individuals get inducted into the normative practice as subject matter subjects, where the subject matter subjects coincide with agent subjects. Okay, so in thinking of them as gaining conceptual expertise, you think of them as subject to ought to be's. But if they have to then coincide with agent subjects of ought to do's, and we're already presupposing that they have conceptual expertise. And he goes on. The answer should be obvious. The members of a linguistic community are first language learners and only potentially people. But subsequently language teachers possess of the rich conceptual framework this implies. They start out by being subject matter subjects of the ought to be and graduate to the status of the agent subjects of the ought to do's. Linguistic ought to be's are translated into uniformities by training. As Wittgenstein has stressed, it's the linguistic community as a self-perpetuating whole, which is the minimum unit in terms of which conceptual activity can be understood. So that explains how, at least it offers an explanation of how we're inducted into an extant normative practice. What it doesn't explain is how the normative practice might develop. I need to take just a couple of seconds to let my dog out the door. He's complaining. So I'll let you dwell on that Sellarsian thought for a minute. Sorry. Let's get back to normative practices. So Sellers' question, as I said, is about induction into a normative practice. But it doesn't explain the genesis of the normative practice itself, which is our problem. And indeed, in some ways, makes it seem very hard how you could get a normative practice off the ground, because the normative practice depends upon the existence of agent subjects of the ought-to-dos. So how is it that we can become subject to ought-to-bes, where an ought-to-be is something one is held to by subject matter subjects of ought-to-dos? Well, it's possible, and this is just my suggestion, I developed this more fully in the paper, but I'm just going to hint at it here, is that if you're thinking of a practice which serves certain practical ends, then it's plausible to suppose that there's a kind of functional correctness which plays the role of the ought-to-dos. It constrains the practice in terms of practicality. And if you're thinking of a situation in which you've got an imitator and a model, it will the ought-to-be, which is underpinned by functional correctness, will constrain both imitator and model. So we can go back to that in discussion if you like, but I don't want to get into any more detail about that here. What I think it means we need to bring to our quick look at the archaeological evidence is that when we look at the archaeological evidence, this comes from before, what we want to find is evidence for active social transmission. And then again, evidence drawn from archaeology. I mean, we know that the functional constraint on the practice exists, but then we want to see how the practice itself frees itself from mere functional correctness. And then we want to have an account of how plausible monitoring processes are involved in the active transmission of technology come to be the kinds of moves you'd expect in a proper monitoring practice. Sorry, proper policing practice. So here's, this is just a summary of a huge amount of evidence in archaeology. So, like I said, I have to say that this evidence is very controversial. But there are many people who argue, for instance, that if you look at what it takes to make a stone tool, it's a very complex process which begins with selection of appropriate stones, with selection of appropriate hammer stones, and then a complex business of knapping the stones to form stone tool. So there'll be stages in which flakes are taken off and then the edges of the tool are retouched. And all of this needs to be done in the right kind of order. So it seems unlikely that this is the kind of practice which could be learned by trial and error afresh by each toolmaker. So the complexity of the process provides evidence for social transmission and perhaps also for active social transmission. It's also a process that's very dangerous. Fingers and eyes can easily get hurt if you don't approach the activity appropriately. So again, that's evidence for social transmission and again, perhaps active social transmission. Another interesting piece of evidence is, and this occurs throughout long periods of the history of toolmaking and in different traditions of toolmaking, is that there's stable differences between assemblages which aren't accounted for purely in terms of difference in material and function. So somehow these seem to be evidence of what one archaeologist said to me seems to be just fashion. Fashion takes hold, and people seem to like to make tools of a certain sort, which is not dictated by the function of the tool. Well, not dictated purely, obviously, by the function of the tool or the material it's made of. So that seems to be evidence of some sort of social transmission, of a kind of culture of making tools. And I guess of active social transmission. But it's also evidence of what I said was talking about before, of how a practice of this sort might become disjoined from its functional constraints. And finally, tool-making techniques, particularly Schulian techniques of making tools, are stable over vast lengths of time. So some archaeologists point out that this shows that what's involved in the transmission is not mere emulation where the product is copied, but imitation. In other words, the process leading to that product is copied as well. And it's also perhaps evidence for active transmission. There is another batch of evidence which is relevant to this, which is current psychological experiments where people set up these cases where they actually observe people under various situations making tools either through some kind of instruction. So either the instruction is purely passive, or it's active in some way, or it uses language, various settings of this sort. I've made nothing really of that kind of evidence. It just seems to me that the context of modern humans who are used to instruction, and particularly verbal instruction, and our ancestors is vast, and the experimental setting and the lives of our ancestors is vast. So although much of that experimentation supports the idea that that active transmission of the technique enhances its transmission, I think it's very hard to place any confidence in that evidence. So, and I also need to say that the archaeological evidence that I've used, it's, I think, strong evidence of social transmission. And it needs further argument to show that it is evidence for active social transmission. Okay. Nonetheless, I think many people argue this, and I think it's not implausible. Next, I want to just point out to various processes that I think then might kick in, which might perhaps lead to a release from functional correctness. So I noted that there was evidence that some aspects of toolmaking are not connected to function. So you might wonder how it might be that the process becomes disconnected from function. So I think there's firstly, the phenomenology of learning is that we're learning a complex process, and often the check on one's making of a tool will be how it's received by whoever the model is, rather than by its final function. There are lots of cases where there might be more than one functionally equivalent way of making a tool, but one embeds itself in the tradition. This is pointed out by Seri Shipton, that over-imitation through mistakes often mean that a tradition of tool making develops aspects which aren't functionally relevant, but are stable within the tradition. These things might be introduced again by copying error, which just becomes a stable part of the tradition and isn't eliminated by poor function or reinforced by improved function. And it may be also that tools change their function, so that what was kept in place as an aspect which served a certain function then no longer is reinforced by that function because the tool changes its function, but nonetheless becomes a feature of the tool in its tradition. Sorry, so I'll just finish that slide. And okay, so the question, my question was how we move from monitoring to policing. And so here we need to grapple with a very different body of literature. I think most of this derives from psychology of imitation, which is problematic for me in, I guess, two ways. So most of this is drawn from current psychological experiments on very often children and apes. But because it's in an experimental situation, the focus is always on the imitator and what the imitator is likely to pick up on. And there's very little stuff about how the model adapts her behavior to the situation. And also many of the experimenters here attribute complex theories of mind and inferential capacities to the imitator, and that conflicts with my methodology. So I'm going to, again, I'm going to be very speculative, and what I'm going to try and do in various suggest is that often the approach which takes theory of mind and inference to be important can be replaced by a more complex view of perception and in particular perceptual salience. And the normative features, I think, start emerging in the business of modelers actively creating or expunging perceptual salience. So I want to move towards the end. So this will be basically the last element of the story that I'm trying to present you. So given a situation in which one has imitation going on, which is actively facilitated by a modeler, you'd expect the modeler to use moves of encouragement and discouragement to promote the development of certain patterns of behavior. But if the demonstrator is aware of how her performance is affecting others and actively adapting her performance for that end, there's going to be cases where, she will firstly be making her behavior perceptually salient. And there's evidence of there's very little evidence of in the animal kingdom of creatures actively demonstrating. But where there's things like a creature will be making a simple tool and that will be imitated, and where the imitator doesn't catch on, the model will repeat her performance and repeat it very deliberately and perhaps slowly. So there's an active attempt to make the behavior perceptually salient and the right aspects of that behavior perceptually salient. And presumably when she recognizes that, as it were, she's made a mistake, she'll try to expunge that salience. So I think what you get is the beginning of moves which start amounting to, which start developing the backward-looking character that I think was characteristic of policing as opposed to monitoring practice. So we start getting moves which are akin to commendation, condemnation, and retraction. And the reason for that is because the model is aware that her actions become exemplary, and I mean she can make others' actions exemplary by, for instance, commending them. She can make sure actions of others aren't taken as exemplary by condemning them. And so the monitoring practice is now targeted on certain behaviors and on their status within the practice as either exemplary or not. So as I said, I think there's a lot of very interesting work in the psychology of imitation, which I think reinforces aspects of the account I want to develop. But one of the problems, as I said, is that the experimenters are inclined to interpret the results in terms of the imitator constructing a theory about what the demonstrator is doing. So trying to divine, for instance, the intentions of the demonstrator, and then inferring how she should realize the intentions of the demonstrator. And all of that is anathema to my approach. But I think one could probably, and this is just really just a suggestion, is that by thinking about how perception might be more complex, one could account for the imitator's performance in terms more of perception than of theory and inference. So I think Gibson's work here on the perception of affordances helps, because it means that the field of initial perceptions is much richer. It involves the perception of not merely an object as such, but what potential the object has for an individual, and the individual's perception of that potential can be influenced by social cues. And then on top of that, you have a perception of salience given this Gibsonian field of affordances. So for instance, I mean, where Tomasello is inclined to think that where one individual completes another individual's nest-making activity, that shows that for Tomasello shows that the individual knows what intention the original nest-maker had. It seems equally likely, and then infers how to fit it in. It seems equally likely that we could explain the situation in terms of the perception of affordances that the material has. So you perceive the material as bed-making material, and you also perceive the salience of the bed-making material given obvious social cues. So I think I'm running short of time that I want to spend speaking, but I mean there are various other experiments that we could look at, or we could look at the detail in discussion if you like. As far as I know, I've only come across one experiment which resists interpretation in terms of its perceptual sensitivities. And so just, I mean, in that experiment you have, and so these are 2-year-old children. There's a set of objects in front of them, an experimenter who's playing a role in the setting sees those objects, then leaves the room. Another object is added to the situation. The experimenter comes back and supposedly names an object in that set. And the evidence is that the child usually takes them to be naming the newly introduced object. That perhaps is a problem because it means that the child is working out the saliency of a particular object based not on its perceptual saliency to herself, but on its being perceptually salient to the experimenter who has returned and for them finds the object novel. For her, it's not novel. But this is an experiment, as I said, with 2-year-olds with pretty sophisticated socialization and some linguistic skill. So my claim is, and it's by no means substantiated, is that much of this work can be explained in terms of the imitator's perceptual sophistication rather than inferential sophistication. Okay, a final thing I want to mention is that I still don't think that even if I'm right about these practices of making and expunging perceptual salience are right, I mean, I still don't think we've got a normative practice. In other words, I don't think we've got a proper policing practice, because a proper policing practice is recursive. Corrections can be corrected, condemnations can be condemned, retractions can be retracted. But I don't see any problem in that developing in the account that I've given. I think it makes no sense to think of encouragements and discouragements being recursive in this way. And the reason for that is that they're not targeted on particular moves. Okay, they're simply moves which have a causal role which is efficacious in a certain setting. Okay, but what I've talked about are moves which somehow make or expunge perceptual salience, and to do that they have to be targeted on specific moves. So they make certain, and their effect is to make a particular move exemplary or to expunge its exemplary status. So once you've got that targeting, for instance, a retraction might be targeted on another retraction, and its effect would be that something which had been exemplary and had that exemplary status removed on retraction then has it restored on having the retraction retracted. Finally, I think there's a kind of aspect to policing practice which is topic neutral. I think to some extent that might be shared with monitoring, but I think policing practice is much less tied to the particular practice it polices. A policing practice, once developed, can police any practice. So it's a strong feature of our cultural lives. And that might be the clue to the point of the evolution of the normative as such. Its role in embedding in a cultural setting various practices, and in particular in solving Lewisian coordination problems. So I've talked for too long, and so we'll just sum up some of my messages. So if nothing else, I'd like to recommend that a focus on evolution of normative practice as opposed to moving directly to the evolution of linguistic practice would be a productive field to investigate. I think it does provide a way of making sense of the idea that language developed in creatures with sophisticated mentality without begging questions about the evolution of content. I think, I've imposed this view of what a normative practice is in terms of a policing practice, but I think that in itself is an interesting way of thinking about the development of norms. I think the pedagogy of technology in general provides a good place for thinking about how policing practice develops. And as I said, and I've made this reservation a few times, if this does anything, it might say something about the evolution of normative practice. There's still an awful lot of work to do in explaining the evolution of specifically linguistic normative practice. I'll stop there.
Thanks for the talk. We still have like 25 minutes for discussions, so plenty of time. Luz, you can start.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bernhard, Weiss, and
Hi.
Hello, everyone. It's been an exhilarating talk, and I have a quick question. I hope to be able to pull it together for you quickly. I suppose I follow most of what you're saying, and I think there's a bit of a jump I'm interested in that takes you from shared practices for, say, the purpose of survival to the production of artifacts. And I wanted to ask you about the perception of affordances as something that necessarily would have to be governed by some sort of ought to be rule. And I wanted to ask you how to explain this because, actually I wanted to make a suggestion and I wanted to hear what you think of it. So somehow we tend to think about practices and the adoption of attitudes and, I don't know, the need for philosophy of mind, and interactions between those who make the tools and those who copy the tool making and so forth. But maybe there's a route that takes you from the activity in a group to a relatively stable and, as it were, standalone product, namely the artifact, which carries and embodies, like you said, possibilities. And somehow you need the idea of the artifact being a standalone container of possibilities, because it's only then that you can ensure that, you said some form of knowledge is being transmitted. And I wondered what you make of that move, because the affordance inherent in an artifact has to somehow be taught, and has to somehow be transmitted. And unless the tool has a certain independence in containing, or the artifact has a certain independence in containing these qualities and affordances, you're back to, transmitting complexities from the one who creates it to the one who's supposed to use it. So I'm thinking this idea of demonstration contained in the artifact containing these possibilities has to somehow be the missing link in moving from tools to rules, because eventually you want to be able to explain concepts as tools for controlling behavior, for controlling, group representation, mapping, and all these things. And the standalone quality of concepts in that function somehow hinges on the idea that a certain complexity is contained or can be put into the artifact as a demonstration of sort of dense possibility. So I don't know if that's something that speaks to you. I'd love to hear what you think of it.
I'd love to be able to do justice to the or everything that you raised there. But I mean, I think firstly, I've said nothing about use of tools and how that's that figures in the whole story. So thank you for that. I mean, I think that's an interesting area for one to think about. But so I take it, I mean, it's just talking about this Gibsonian affordances stuff. I mean, that's supposed to apply and I don't think you meant this, that, I mean, it sounded like you might be saying that it applied only to the perception of the potential of a tool. But it's obviously much wider. Any object in its ecological setting can have various affordances for the creatures, yeah. But because of that, I mean, the perception of affordances has to be something which is quite distinct from ought to be's anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess because of that, I'm thinking that, although it needs a lot more thinking about, that the use of tools, you might be right, depends upon perception of affordances. But that might, I mean, and that might mean that it's less interesting in terms of the evolution of norms, because it sounds like the use of a tool involves perception of affordances, and that's a much more primitive capacity than the type of capacity involved in normative practice and in language.
I guess I'm inclined to disagree, because the implicit abilities inherent in tool use can be very complex and rich, right? So I wouldn't downgrade that over against conceptual abilities.
Yeah, that might be which I think means that it's got to be maybe in perception of affordances, but an awful lot else besides that. And you're right that I mean, so I'm glad I added that reservation where I said that, I mean, my interest in tool making is to say that there's a plausible story which involves tool making and social transmission of the techniques of tool making in the evolution of a normative practice. But there might be a lot of other practices which are similarly involved, and if there were, I think that would be reinforce the kind of story I want to tell. So you might be right that the use of tools is another practice which involves active social transmission. Fire making is another. It's just that the archaeological evidence that goes with fire making and my reading of what exists about it is much less. But yes, as many situations in which you can think of a role for active social transmission of technology, that would just be add to the story, add to its richness. So thanks.
Thank you.
Ronald, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this rich talk. Really excited. I'm looking forward to actually reading the paper. I have a quick question just regarding your remarks at the very end, tying it back to one of the desideratas that you initially listed for the project. I mean, you said that one of the things you'd like to accomplish in this project is to tell a story about the evolutionary advantages of policing practices over mere monitoring practices, if I understood. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit. So I understood you saying at the very end that policing is kind of evolutionarily advantageous because it's generic. So if we have certain patterns of behavior that are part of an evolved policing practice, then once the policing practice is evolved, it can be extended to other kinds of patterns of behavior. And if I understood this correctly, then my question is, why should that be, evolutionarily speaking, be an advantage rather than a burden for a group of social organisms? I mean, one could think that the policing practice actually weights the organisms down if things change in the environment or so. So I just wonder whether you could say a little more.
Yeah, I wish I think I'll say this in response to every question. I wish I could say a bit more. So I think of the policing practice as what I call a kind of topic neutrality, so that it can shift swiftly and easily from one overseeing practice to overseeing one practice to overseeing a range of different practices. I mean, I must say, when I was rereading this in preparation, I realized, there's a tension in what I'm saying, because I do conjecture that the monitoring practice involved in rank hierarchies might shift to a pedagogical setting. So I don't think that, so what I'm saying is I need to do quite a bit more thinking to get clearer about exactly the kind of topic neutrality I think exists in policing practice as opposed to monitoring practice. But I think what I want to say is that the point about monitoring practice and the moves involved in monitoring practice is that they have this causal role in a setting of other moves, but they can't target specific moves. And so what's powerful about a proper policing practice is both that they target specific moves, and so they then get this kind of the capacity to be recursive. And I think that makes them more powerful, because it means that there's a way in which the practice can be more thoroughly reflective. But then to address your question, which was why, then it becomes something that can swiftly move from one set of practices to another. And I think the reason why I think that's an advantage is that I think it means that if there's a pattern of behavior which is beneficial, there's quite a powerful means to bring that pattern of behavior under a kind of cultural umbrella. So it's a powerful means of enculturation. And then I think the interesting story would be then to be able to tell some story about cultural evolution and how policing practice plays a role in that. And you're right, and it might. I don't think it would hamper it. You're right. There's a kind of conservativeness now operating. So outliers would be a problem, because they're brought back into the fold by a policing practice. You would have to tell some story about how usually the community's behavior is more likely to be right than an outlier's behavior, or more likely to be beneficial. But that's all I can say.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful talk, also for a wonderful paper that I read this morning.
Thank you.
And it's really exceptional that I agree with almost everything I read in a paper. That was a memorable occasion. But there were one or two things that I was worrying about, and one is the notion of this idea that you can expunge the salience of something, a move or an object, and that I'm a bit puzzled by that, because I can see how you can raise the salience of something. I mean, you can raise the salience of something by referring to it or pointing to it or holding it up in the air. But I find it much harder to imagine what you could do to an object to make it less salient, except by making other things more salient. And I think that matters, because you describe a form of, let's say, primitive interaction, primitive because it's not fully normative, the effect of which is that an object or a move becomes less salient or not salient. And what you want to, and here let me quote the passage where I really started puzzling. so retraction here involves alteration of a move's status from one to be copied to one to be ignored. So here you use the notion of ignorance, which seems to be not the kind of thing that you really want to say, right? And then you say, comma, it becomes no longer salient, right? So it moves from, let's say, you want to prevent others from adopting a certain epistemic attitude towards this move, right, to something which you would describe in perceptual terms. Right? So I'm not entirely comfortable with this part of this transition here, and I don't really understand what's going on.
Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure I do either. But so the idea is this. I mean, where I'm talking about expunging salience, I might say this in the paper, but I think what I'm thinking of is moves, expunging the salience of a move rather than an object.
Yeah.
And so typically this is done by cues which signal that a move was accidental.
Yeah.
So there's a paper by Carpenter and Core where they contrast saying whoops and saying there, and how those cues are picked up on by children, and they will only copy the action which was clearly, well, their terminology is clearly intended as opposed to the action which was accidental. So I'm thinking that, and so this connects with my problem about these experiments in that they're always focused on the imitator rather than the model. But if the imitator is sensitive to social cues, which it can expunge salience, then I don't think it's implausible to suggest that in a natural setting of imitation, that a model might exploit certain cues to expunge salience. So, and they might well develop out of just natural behaviors which indicate an accident, but then might be deliberately deployed when you realize that what you've done isn't, well, I want to say it wasn't the right move.
I mean, one way of maybe this is a way of rephrasing my worry is that, I mean, I fully agree with what you're trying to do. I'm just wondering whether the notion of salience, which is basically a perceptual notion that you enrich a little bit, right, but not too much, is the one that's going to help in this case. Because basically what you want to have is that certain moves should be highlighted, not only highlighted, but separated from others as being probably more relevant to your concerns, something like that, right? So, but you can make a clumsy move, which you will interpret, which will naturally be interpreted as being accidental, right? But it can be very salient that you are being clumsy. Right? So
yes.
And then you want to say that somehow this the clumsiness, which is somehow in some sense visible, right, lowers the salience of the move, and that doesn't seem right to me.
But I guess what I want to say is that what you're building up is a practice determined by a set of moves whose status is exemplary. Mm-hmm. And so that's the relevant notion of salience, and not a move is salient if it counts as exemplary.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm thinking of a kind of second-order practice which can alter the status of a move as exemplary or not. And yes, I've tried to explain that in terms of salience.
Okay.
But you might be right that I can see what you mean. It might be too broad a notion to do the kind of work I wanted to do.
Well, I mean, yeah, maybe let's drop this. I mean, there are other questions as well.
Okay, but thank you very much. It's a nice.
I'll write to you later today.
Okay, I look forward to that.
So we'll follow in the discussion with Yada.
Okay, not really a question, but a comment, I would say, because I too agree with almost everything you say, and I find it interesting. For example, what I find very important is your claim that on the way to genuine normativity, we must shift the attention from objects and persons to kinds of behavior. I find it really crucial, and also I think that your explanation of the role of normativity in toolmaking and technology, that's also interesting, it seems to me. The only thing I'm not really convinced, and I don't know how much you insist on it, is that the production of tangible tools kind of should predate the forging of such intangible tools like expressions of language. So it seems to me that expressions are also tools, and that I'm not sure why we should assume that I don't know whether that's what you want to say, that the linguistic normativity must be predated by the normativity implicit to the toolmaking.
I'm not sure I've got your question is why toolmaking associated with normativity associated with toolmaking should predate normativity associated with language.
Right. Yes.
I mean, so I don't know, but I mean, I just believe what I read sometimes, and what I'm told. I mean, the toolmaking practice goes back, say, 2 million years or so, whereas most people, I think of language as developing something like 150,000 years ago.
So that's only this considerations that, as a matter of fact, toolmaking most probably appeared before language, not that the norms implicit to language or rules implicit to language must be derived from those.
So yeah, so you're right. So toolmaking goes. I think. I don't know. I think I'll go out on a limb. I think everyone thinks that toolmaking existed long before language existed.
Okay.
And so, if I'm right, then a kind of normative practice existed long before language existed. And then that raises two questions. One is whether that normative practice provided a ground for the development of the normative practice which we think of as linguistic. And it just seems to me plausible that it might, but I can't say that it did. And if it did, then there's a second question, which is why on earth it took so long from the development of normative practice itself to the development of specifically linguistic normative practice, because there could be somewhere in the region of 1 million years where very little happened. We had a normative practice which was used in transmitting toolmaking techniques, but didn't develop into a representational or linguistic system. So I think there's those questions, and I have no answers to them yet, or I suspect I won't ever. But does that address what you were worrying about?
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer.
So we are running out of time, but I will use my authority to say two comments. First, I would like to thank you for contributing to the issue. It's really rich paper. I have read it several times, and I always find something new there. And one thing
I always find something new, but it's always wrong.
And one thing that came up to my mind during this talk is that whether there is any correlation between the evolution of normative practices and no function policing, as you are talking about it, and for example, group religious practices or rituals, because it seems like that religious practices are a really good example of something that is no function practice. Because if you are, having a ritual for a good crop, then you basically have no function, no direct function.
Yes.
There. So it might be interesting to look for some kind of correlations. But that's just the comment. I'm not sure whether you did something like that or no.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, I think be interested because I think a lot of our understanding of rituals which are much more recent than the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, and so are rituals that post-date the development of language. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm obsessed with tools, but there are cases of tools that seem to have no functional use at all. This is the way it seems to us. They're too big to be actively used, and sometimes made extraordinarily perfectly. So it could be the development of a practice which is constrained by aesthetics. So it could be art, and then once I guess that gets fixed by cultural normative practices, then I don't know what else that you would call that except a kind of ritual. So yes, it's also an interesting aspect to the whole thing.
And the second comment is basically advertising of the next talk. This is going to be part of this series because you mentioned several times experiments with kids. And
yes.
As a matter of fact, Antonio Scarafone wrote a paper about how to interpret those experiments that we have with the kids in terms of commitments and commitment sharing. So mostly focusing on pointing behavior. I think that your talk and your paper and his paper are extremely compatible in giving some kind of broader picture on what role commitments and normativity plays in our lives. And so I would like to hear your opinion on his paper, but
okay.
I understand.
So, when is his talk?
In 2 weeks.
Okay.
At the same time in 2 weeks.
Okay, I'll make a note of that. That sounds interesting.
And basically the idea is that any kind of research on pointing behavior can be interpreted from the perspective of commitment first approach or normativity approach. So it might be interesting to look into the connections between.
Sounds fascinating.
Between your talk, your paper, and his paper.
Yeah.
But now we are out of the time, so I would like to thank you once more for giving the talk and everyone else for engaging in discussion.
Can I thank you all again for your participation, the questions, and the invitation, and apologize for my dogs.
No problem.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.